Hello. Today's video for the Cadillac 472-500, I'm going to talk about the 425 intake. 425 is still in the same family. It's technically 472-500, 425, 368 is the whole family. Now I don't tend to do a lot with the 425 and certainly not the 368, but it's all the same family of motors. So this 425 intake will bolt up to 472-500. Now, the difference in this intake is, of course, obvious. It's a single plane intake as opposed to the dual plane intake that was on the 472 and 500. And I know you're going to say, well, I don't need a high RPM intake. Single planes are for high RPM. And that's not completely true. In reality, it's about airspeed, and we'll get into that in a minute. The basic intake for the 425 is low profile, just like the dual plane is for the 500. And I like this intake a lot. In fact, I was running this intake before the Edelbrock existed, and it's actually what was on the car when I got the Edelbrock and wind up swapping it on. This is actually a pretty good intake, and I'm not the only one that likes it. There is a PDF in the group that is a guy, Circle Track, that was running this intake with the center cutout. And I've talked to other guys that have done the same thing, and everybody's been pretty happy with how this runs for a stock intake. Now, one of the disadvantages when we talked about working on the dual plane is this transition point is hard to modify and get, and that's the carburetor, and the dual plane really has no plenum. It's 4-hole, remember. But to try and cut it open and get in there and blend the transition from the plenum area into the runner is a little hard to do. On the 425 intake, you can cut this out, and this 4-hole part just goes away because it's not really attached to anything on the bottom because it's a single plane intake. And that lets you open up the plenum area so you have a bit of a plenum, and that lets you do some other things. So one of the other advantages, and why I think the 425 went to single plane, is single planes tend to have a little better fuel distribution than a dual plane. When you've got all those crisscrossy runners and no real plenum, and they come in and share together, the dual planes can have mixture problems. You can't really adjust them always to just perfect. You usually got to be a little bit on the rich side because you may have a cylinder here or there that's a little lean. And the single plane doesn't tend to do that. That's one of the reasons I went to this intake years ago. I was running nitrous oxide at the time, and I wanted a little better distribution and a little more mid-range maybe. And I think this gives you just a bit more mid-range. I cut the center out. Like I said, they come with 4 holes. And this really worked out real well. You can put one of those basic open quadrajet to square flange adapters on top of it and run a square flange carburetor. Because the plenum is open, the carburetor bore isn't nearly as problematic as trying to get an adapter to run in on the dual plane or running a big open one only to have the air hit the stuff sitting on top. So by being able to run a regular Holly, I was running like a 750 double pumper. It made life a little easier for me because I was, of course, racing. And with nitrous plate in there, the nitrous did well, fuel distribution was good. Like I said, I really liked this intake and it ran real well. I bring it up, I mean, I'm doing all the intakes to show you, but I partially bring it up because it's really not a bad low-cost alternative if you're building a really basic motor. Now, flow-wise, this flows just a couple of CFM less than the dual plane intake does that's on the 472-500. Um, that one was good for like 226. This one's good for like 222, 224. Um, it's basically right there. Now, it has the low profile and does the angle better going into the head. So you don't have the transition problems that you would with like the Edelbrock intake that we talked about. That helps too when you get up at higher RPM, because that's really about the high airspeed not being able to make those turns. You know, in a race motor, if you watch videos about intakes or whatnot, I mean, they'll tell you that technically what you want is as straight a shot from the carburetor as into the back of the valve as you can get, because the high-speed air doesn't always like to do the turns, and that's one of the problems with the Edelbrock if you try and push it up in RPM too much. Now, like I said, this intake is really more about a basic motor, and I wrote a few notes down because I wanted you guys to know, but what I was running this on was basically a regular late model motor. Now, it was 552 heads, which are the big chamber heads. It was a stock lower end. It was a 234 cam at 50. So a little bit of a cam, and the heads had just a slight valve increase in size. Stock valve on a head is 2-inch. I went to a 2040, so we're just talking 40 thousandths bigger. And that was really about trying to clean up the seat area and low lift flow. I wasn't really trying to port the head as such, but I was trying to improve the flow a little bit right at the valve. This was all, like I said, this was back in the early 90s, and this was all following industry standard of you want the valve to be the restriction, the port, whatever it flows, which is for a stock port, is 226. You want the intake to flow about the same, and then the carburetor to just flow enough to feed it and keep it all fed. And that ensures that you don't have any ups and downs in airspeed. And that's supposed to make everything work, and it does. It worked very well for basically a stock motor. That's why I didn't put in a really big valve and try and get flow, especially since, like I said, this only flows about the same thing as the stock port. So we're really talking a basic, you know, just a little bit better than the stock motor, and this is kind of viable. You know, just slightly improve right at the seat and run an intake that's just a little bit better and run a cam that's just a little bit bigger. And all of that will come in and help. Now, part of why this motor made power is camshaft, of course. Now, the duration is like 35 degrees more duration than a stock cam, and it had more lift. So I'm at like 550 lift. That at least, you know, even if I can't change the CFM, that at least ensures I'm getting more air across the valve to make more horsepower. So that motor, and I checked my notes to make sure because it was dynoed a long time ago, that motor made right at 350 horsepower, like 348 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. So even though it's single plane, I want you to note that peak with a bigger cam actually only happened at 4,000 RPM. That is not a very high RPM. This is not a high RPM intake in that kind of combination. You know, and don't think of single planes as strictly, you know, high RPM only, you're going to give up the low RPM. All that stuff you've read about intakes and about motors, for that matter, are almost always based on the small block Chevy. And the Cadillac has small block Chevy airflow, but with 500 cubic inches. So it kind of changes how things work. And one of the things is if you put a big single plane intake on a small block, yeah, the RPM is going to be up. You need converter, you need gear, you need cam to all make it work. Well, that's not really true at first with the Cadillac. Now, I know you're thinking, well, it's going to give up low end torque. I need to worry about my off idle torque. And technically, that torque, and I didn't test them back to back. I did not test, the dual plane factory to the single plane factory, and I wanted to. I wanted to do that with Richard. I even took this intake down to Cadco, and I couldn't convince Richard or Courtney to do any dyno testing on this intake. They wanted to do the fancier intakes. And I even tried to get Richard to take this intake with him and test it on his motor when he got back to West Tech, because I think this would have done a lot better and given him a bit of an increase over just the stock motor. Plus, he was talking about nitrous and turbo, and I felt that the single plane was a much better choice for testing that. And I think part of the reason he ran into troubles was because the dual plane does have distribution problems, and as he added boost to it, that made it worse. And I don't think this would have shown it, but I couldn't convince either one of them to try it. If I get a chance again at some point, I may push the issue harder, because I would like to show you guys this can do better. And I only have this one dyno test with this intake to really, talk to you about. Now, like I said, you're thinking I'm giving up low end torque if I'm running a single plane intake, and that's not really true. This motor at load in, which we were doing about 2,800 RPM, that was about as low as I could go. It made 540 foot-pounds of torque with this intake, and that's at load in at 2,800. So that's no slouch for a single plane intake. And part of that is the cam. As you increase breathing on a Cadillac, because it's got such limited, like I said, small block Chevy breathing, but 500 cubic inches. So the camshaft, just like the single plane intake, doesn't behave quite like you'd expect. You would think with 234 degrees of duration that the motor would start losing low end power because of the camshaft. Now, it was ground on a wider lobe center, so I was careful about overlap, like I've talked about in the cam video. Overlap is what hurts you. But for the Cadillac, you need more duration if you don't have more airflow, because those are the only two ways you're really getting air into the motor. And so initially, when you start going up in duration, you see a gain in torque. And so the combination worked really well. A single plane, good distribution. Like I said, it made 540 foot-pounds of torque. Now for me, that was working out really well, because at that point, I'm in the Monte Carlo. I have a 2500 stall converter in it and 355 gears in the back. So I'm getting right up into the main torque band instantaneously. So it was a good combination for low budget. And a lot of what I was doing was very low budget. The intake you can get at the wrecking yard fairly cheap. Now, when I was looking at the dyno sheet, just to let you know, basically the horsepower dropped off by about 4,600 RPM. And that's still not very high. And it was really pretty much done by 5,000 RPM. And that is not untypical of a 500 cubic inch Cadillac motor, even when you're first starting to hot rod it. You don't jump up in RPM because, like I said, you don't have the airflow. So all of this works pretty well because it tends to be lower RPM. So, like I said, the single plane intake with the center cut out gives you some advantages. I talked about a different carb. You also, because you have sharing, remember we talked about on the dual plane, you're only drawing off of half of the carburetor. That's part of the reason it's 800 CFM. Because you don't have the sharing, you can go smaller. That's why the 750 double pumper, even though I was trying to go higher RPM and bigger cam and more racy, worked really well. And actually, at one point, when I didn't have the 750, I ran a regular 600 vacuum secondary Holly on this for a while and just drove the car around, and it drove around just fine. And like I've talked about before, the carb size is sometimes about sharing. When the intake is split and you're only drawing, each runner draws individually, when you're only drawing on one half of it, then the carb needs to probably be a little bit bigger. And we even see that on the Edelbrock. If you're really trying to go all out on the Edelbrock, you're almost better with, a Dominator on it, or a really big, 1000 CFM square flange carburetor. If you start getting up into, trying to make that 550 horsepower out of the Edelbrock, you got to have a lot of carb on it, because even though it's got that little split, that little depression in it, it's not sharing as much as a big open plenum will do. So one of the advantages I consider is this could actually take a smaller carburetor, which is easier to get. You could, if you're just kind of driving, you could technically run, like I said, a 600 Edelbrock or Holly. Now, technically, to really get the most out of it, you need, a 700, 750. But it doesn't really flow enough to go to a really big carburetor. So you could run the 800 Quadrajet on it if you want. It's got the air control valve. You don't probably need quite that much carb, but if you wanted to, you could. I mean, it is regular Quadrajet pattern. But I like to be able to run some other carbs and swap things around. Plus, like I said, if you're wanting to get into nitrous, today's plates are better. I mean, this was back in the 90s, and one of the problems with those early bar plates, which is why you see all these fancy plates now, is their distribution wasn't real good. And when I went to the Edelbrock from this intake, trying to run nitrous, and I was running 250 horse of nitrous. So, I mean, we're talking, a 350 horsepower motor with 250 horsepower of nitrous. I mean, it was a fun car when you hit the button. And the distribution was really important. But when I went to the Edelbrock, I actually had to go to a different nitrous plate because the distribution was so poor. And that really gave me trouble, and I actually kind of messed up a piston in one motor. Luckily, they're basically stock motors because the distribution was so far off. And that's one of the things that I really like about this intake is distribution. Now, if you're just trying to do, like I said, a basic, a little bit better than stock cruiser, that distribution can be important too. Not necessarily with nitrous, but with how you tune the carburetor. One of the problems on dual planes is you can't always get down to that very fine, perfect mixture because the mixture's uneven. If you lean it out enough that that one O2 sensor you have shows it correct, then it doesn't seem like it runs right. Well, that's because you may have two cylinders or one or two cylinders that are way lean because the mixture's off. And so you have to fatten it up a little bit and run a little richer mixture in order to make sure that it runs correctly. Well, with a single plane, which is part of the reason these are used more in late model, you don't have to do that. You can get it down to that leaner condition because the distribution is a little bit better. And that should let you run a little bit better on the road and fine tune it just a little bit better. Now, yeah, this is a blower. And yeah, it's been sitting there and I haven't talked about it at all. So this intake I feel was very versatile. That's part of the reason I went to it. I could put a quadrajet on it. I could put a Holly carburetor on it. One point, because I only had the carburetor for a very short time, I ran a 2-barrel 500 on it. It's the only working carb at the time I had, and I needed to drive the car. So I just put an adapter plate on it, and this big open plenum let me do anything. I put nitrous plates on it without any trouble, and I put this blower on the top of this intake without any trouble. And again, I liked it because it was open and not the dual plane. Now, this little supercharger, little mini charger, has something that's kind of hard to find these days, but this has an adapter plate on the bottom that goes to a carbureted flange. This was a B&M product. I bought this particular supercharger off of eBay. It was meant for out of a kit for a Pontiac. And a lot of motors that weren't small block Chevy, people made basic kits for in order to let you run a little supercharger on it. Well, like I said, I bought this used. I had to rebuild the entire supercharger. New strips, new bearings, new gaskets, seals. I mean, I had to work on it. But it had this adapter plate on it, and that's what caught my attention. This is like a 174. Later on, they made it a little bigger. I think we made it as a 177. And all it had was an adapter plate on the bottom that went to the carburetor, and then the supercharger bolted to that, and then your carburetor bolted on top. And I know you're thinking, well, that didn't help at all. It's an itty bitty supercharger. All she did was heat the air. That's not true. It made 6 pounds of boost, a little over. I had to wind it out pretty hard. That was probably about the limit of it. But a stock motor, like I said, with a little cam and, that's 350. A stock motor with 6 pounds of boost, that's like a 50% increase in power. That's like 150 horsepower boost all the time. And that's about what it made. And so this was a very good combination and really did well on this intake for more than one reason. The open plenum was a help, but the low profile was also a help because I was able to keep this underneath the hood. So the low profile is also a benefit. Remember, the Edelbrock sits up here. The Bulldog sits even higher. It's like 3/4 of an inch higher than the Edelbrock. And so this had some advantages at the time. I really, really enjoyed running this intake and what I could do with it. Now, for some of the rest of you, and I was in the Monte Carlo by the time I was using this intake, but I know some of you are in Eldorados, and the Eldorado, part of the reason the low profile on all the stock intakes is because of the Eldorado. You don't have hood clearance. The engine is sitting up because the trainee's sitting underneath it, and you got the half shafts and everything in there, and you don't have the room that you do on other cars. And that's why all the intakes are low profile. That's why the end of the runner is a little bit different on all the Cadillac heads. Cadillac made it to fit the Eldorado, but then they just made all the motors the same. They didn't differentiate. They didn't make a different head for, the sedan DeVille where they could have done a regular intake. They just went ahead and made the motor like it was, the way it would fit in the Eldorado, and just made them all the same. Very common with GM, so that all the parts are the same. So this could be some benefit to you if you were fighting that hood clearance problem, or you're in a swap where maybe you had to mount the motor a little higher. This is lower profile. Now, like I said, you're not going to go full-fledged racing on this intake. It doesn't really flow any more than stock. It's basically going to be just a little bit better than stock. But a lot of guys are just building a little bit better than stock. So this intake, a little better cam, your low profile, so you could probably keep it under the hood. It has room up here for that big AC compressor if you're trying to keep it in place. Now the brackets are different on the 425, so if you're planning on keeping that AC compressor up here, then you probably want to grab the brackets for it at the same time that you're getting an intake out of the junkyard. Now, like I said, this is a very viable, basic solution. It's a good intake. You know, it flows as much as the regular intake. It's a little different. It's not super high RPM, and you can kind of clean up the plenum and get it to run better. So, like I said, that's the 425 intake, which was right after the 500 motor. So you're talking 77, 78, 79. Now, this one is a little different. I ran across this one. I'm pretty sure it came off of a 425. But I pulled this off of, like, I want to say it was an 80 limousine. And I don't think it was 368 at that point. But this is single plane, just like this one is. But this is made out of aluminum. This is a much lighter intake. This is going to be heavy, just like the factory dual plane intake. The drawback to this, I was really excited when I got it because it was aluminum. But when I flow tested it, this flows a little bit less than this one does. This is like 186 CFM. Now, I don't know if they purposely reduced the cross section to increase the airspeed to help the low end of the limousine with the 425. That's what I suspect that this was about. If you go down in cross section, you're going to lose top end, but the airspeed at lower RPM goes up, and that helps your low end torque. So this is ever so slightly smaller than the regular 425 single plane. And I think that's also why it's made out of aluminum, is I don't think they made a lot of them. And I suspect it was made because the limousine is going to be a slow, heavy, low RPM car. So they were trying to just improve it a little bit. Now, in 80, I'm pretty sure it was just a standard 425. I am not way up on limousines, so maybe one of you guys can put in the comments, you know, the limo ran this motor in that year or what it was. But most 368s I ever run across, you know, 81 was the 468 motor. And this wasn't that. This was a standard carbureted, regular sort of motor. Also, I got this so many years ago, I wasn't as versed on identifying motors as I am today. So maybe one of you that runs across one of these somewhere or has already picked one up somewhere and you had a better look at the intake, or not the intake, but the motor, you can tell us what motor that really was. Like I said, I suspect it's kind of a special 425 motor in that year. These both had EGR. It's both certainly later model. Of course, I block off the EGR because I was using it for racing. I have not run this intake, so I can't tell you a lot about it. I was a little disappointed with the flow. I was going to, at the time, swap this in for this one because I thought maybe it was the same exact casting, just aluminum. And I wanted a lighter intake, aluminum intake. I was going to kind of polish it up. But being light, slightly lower airflow, this is going to be better for maybe a little heavier vehicle, a little lower RPM. Now, like I said, this one, even at, what was I at on tipping? 2,800 RPM, was still making a lot of torque. So this one is really going to be making torque right off idle at that 1,000 RPM mark. You know, it's going to be going right away, and it'll probably be done 500 RPM earlier than this. So, you know, in this case, we said it didn't really drop to about 4,600 RPM. This one's probably going to be done at like 4,000 RPM. So that's another intake that's out there, though they're pretty rare. I've seen 2 or 3 of them in my life. I snagged this one when I could, and a couple other guys have come up with them. But the only time I've ever seen them is on the limousine, and it was in, you know, the 425 era of motors. So that's the 425 intake. Um, don't think of it as high RPM, and think of it as a little more flexible if you're trying to do stuff on a budget. So, like I said, I like this intake. It's a good alternative. When I went to the Edelbrock, I gained nothing. This was the intake that was on the car. I switched to the Edelbrock when I got it brand new, and the ET of the car didn't change at all. I maybe picked up a little bit of off-idle torque, but in my car that wasn't a big help. Like I said, I was running a 2500 stall converter. So I really didn't see any change at all from this intake to the Edelbrock intake when I swapped them out on the car. Now, I didn't do a backup dyno test. At the time, me trying to get to a dyno with a motor was a lot harder to do. I don't have the benefit of CAD company having a dyno at the shop where they can just dyno as they please. But I would like to do a little more testing on this intake because I was that happy with it. It really ran well, and I'd like to kind of see AB against the cast iron intake to be able to tell guys what happens, because I suspect the only real difference is this one, because of the sharing on the carburetor, it's going to have a better mid-range peak. So I would actually expect that to go up a bit, and I don't think you'll lose a lot of low-end torque with it. So anyway, that's the 425 intake, and I wish you all luck on your projects, and I will catch you next time with another intake, and we'll talk some more about how things work. Talk to you later. Bye.